We are taught in school that the golden age of the Netherlands was a triumph of human ingenuity. We are told of the Dutch masters Rembrandt and Vermeer, painting in light and shadow, and of the brave merchant sailors who conquered the seven seas to bring spices from the east. To the outside observer in the year 1630, the Dutch Republic appeared as a miracle. It was a tiny sliver of swampy land that had somehow become the richest nation on earth. But history teaches us a darker lesson, that sudden, unearned wealth is not a blessing. It is a virus. This is the story of the first true economic fever in modern history. It is a cautionary tale that echoes loudly in our modern world of crypto bubbles and stock market manias, because it demonstrates a brutal geopolitical truth. You do not need a war to destroy a nation. You simply need a dream that everyone is willing to buy into. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must travel back to the bustling canals of Amsterdam in the middle of the 17th century. At the time, the city was the beating heart of the global financial system, the clearinghouse of world trade, and the arbiter of international law. Gold and silver were flowing into the city like a tide, but beneath this surface of imperial majesty, a foundation of greed was rotting. While other nations were still fighting medieval wars over land and religion, the Dutch were inventing the future. They had created the first stock exchange, the first multinational corporation, and the first global currency. They were a society of merchants who valued the ledger over the sword, but everything changed when a single exotic flower arrived from the east. The tulip was not just a plant, it was a status symbol. It was a geological freak of nature, possessing vibrant colors that no European flower could match. At first it was a luxury for the aristocracy, the gold of the garden, but soon the Dutch learned the hardest lesson in economics, that gold is not wealth. Gold is a drug, and the Netherlands was about to overdose. They didn't realize that money is never neutral. Every investment is a tether, every contract is a chain. They thought they could buy the appearance of infinite prosperity using other people's money, but they were walking straight into a trap that would leave the nation hollowed out and empty. To the modern mind, the idea of a nation collapsing over a flower bulb seems like a comedy of errors. But in 1634, the tulip was the high-tech semiconductor of its day. It was a biological breakthrough that defied the laws of nature. Most tulips were predictable solid reds or yellows, but occasionally a bulb would break. It would produce petals streaked with swirling patterns of crimson, purple, and white, resembling flames or lightning. The Dutch didn't know it yet, but these beautiful patterns were actually the result of a mosaic virus. The very thing that made the flower valuable was a disease that was slowly killing the plant. It is the perfect metaphor for the Dutch economy. The more beautiful the profit looked, the more certain the eventual death of the system. As the demand for these broken bulbs grew, the market underwent a sinister transformation. It moved from the garden to the tavern. Because tulips only bloom for a few weeks in the spring and can only be moved while dormant in the summer, the trade was naturally limited. But the Dutch merchants were too clever for the constraints of time and space. They invented what we now call futures contracts. They began trading pieces of paper that represented the right to buy a bulb at the end of the season. Suddenly, you didn't need a garden to be a tulip trader. You didn't even need a flower. You just needed a signature and a dream. This was the birth of wind handle, the trade of wind. People were buying and selling ghosts. The financial virus began to spread through every layer of Dutch society. It was no longer just the wealthy elite playing the game. The chimney sweep, the cobbler, and the maidservant began to liquidate their meager assets to buy a fraction of a broken bulb. They saw their neighbors becoming overnight millionaires, and they felt the most dangerous emotion in economics: envy. They believed that the laws of gravity had been suspended. They thought they had found a perpetual motion machine for wealth, where the price of a bulb would only ever go up, forever. They were no longer looking at the flower. They were looking at the number on the ledger. They had decoupled value from reality. The tulip was no longer a plant. It was a speculative vehicle, a currency that was being printed by the sun and the soil. But, as every gambler eventually learns, when you trade in wind, you eventually reap the whirlwind. By 1636, the fever had reached its breaking point. The tulip market was no longer an exchange of goods. It was a psychological warfare of escalating numbers. A single bulb of the Semper Augustus, the most prized of, all was now being priced at 5,500 guilders. To put that into perspective, that was enough money to purchase one of the grandest mansions on the most expensive canal in Amsterdam, complete with a coach and a team of horses. Or, if you preferred, it could buy enough grain to feed a small village for a decade. But why would anyone pay the price of a palace for a plant that would eventually wither and die? The answer is the same one that drives every bubble from the South Sea to Silicon Valley, the greater fool theory. You don't buy a tulip because you love the flower. You buy it because you believe there is someone out there even more desperate, even more greedy, or even more foolish than you are, who will buy it for twice the price tomorrow. The Dutch government, usually so pragmatic and cautious, watched from the sidelines. They were intoxicated by the tax revenue and the illusion of a booming economy. They didn't realize that this wasn't growth. It was a transfer of wealth from the productive to the speculative. The blacksmith had stopped hammering iron. The weaver had stopped throwing the shuttle. Why work for a year to earn a few hundred guilders when you could make 1,000 in an afternoon by flipping a contract for a viceroy bulb? The college meetings, informal trading sessions held in the back rooms of smoke-filled taverns became the real parliament of the Netherlands. Here, the rules of reality were rewritten. They even began to weigh bulbs by Paris, a unit of measurement so small it was usually reserved for diamonds. They were treating organic matter like precious gems. But as the winter of 1636 turned into the spring of 1637, a cold realization began to settle over the market. The prices had reached such astronomical heights that the greater fools were starting to run out. The supply of new suckers was drying up. The elite merchants, the ones who had started the game, began to quietly exit their positions. They knew that a market built on air cannot withstand a breeze. The trap was set, the spring was coiled, and the entire Dutch middle class was standing directly over the pit, waiting for a signal that would never come. The turning point didn't come with a bang, but with a silence. On February 3rd, 1637, in the city of Haarlem, a group of traders gathered for a routine auction. They offered a collection of common bulbs for sale, expecting the usual frenzy of bidding. But this time, no one raised their hand. The room went cold. The silence was the sound of a heartbeat stopping. The virus of doubt proved more contagious than the mania of greed. Within days, the panic spread from Haarlem to Amsterdam. Suddenly, the contracts of wind were being blown away. Everyone wanted to sell. No one wanted to buy. The price of a tulip didn't just drop, it vanished. In the span of a week, assets that were worth the price of a merchant ship were now worth less than a bag of onions. But the real tragedy wasn't the loss of the flowers. It was the destruction of the social contract. Because the market was built on credit, on promises to pay at a future date, the crash triggered a chain reaction of defaults. The cobbler couldn't pay the baker because the merchant hadn't paid him for a tulip contract that was now worthless. The legal system was paralyzed. Thousands of lawsuits flooded the Dutch courts, but the judges faced an impossible dilemma. If they forced people to pay the astronomical prices promised in the contracts, they would bankrupt the entire nation. If they canceled the debts, they would destroy the sanctity of the contract, the very foundation of Dutch capitalism. The government, which had stood by while the bubble grew, now stepped in with a desperate compromise. They ruled that contracts could be settled for just 10% of their face value. It was a managed bankruptcy, a haircut for an entire civilization. But the damage was done. The trust that had made the Netherlands the financial capital of the world had been liquidated. The Dutch learned a bitter lesson that we are still struggling to grasp today. Wealth that is created by a ledger can be destroyed by a ledger. They had mistaken a speculative fever for economic growth. They thought they were the masters of finance, but they were merely the victims of a mathematical inevitability. The golden age continued for a time, but the spirit of the nation had changed. The reckless optimism was gone, replaced by a haunting realization that at any moment, the ground beneath their feet, the very soil that grew their beautiful flowers, could turn into a pit. Today we look back at the Tulip Mania as a quaint folly of a bygone era, a story of crazy people in funny hats. But that is the most dangerous mistake we can make. We like to think we are more sophisticated than the 17th century Dutch because we have high-speed fiber optics and complex algorithms. But the human brain hasn't had an upgrade in 40,000 years. The same neurochemistry that drove a Dutch merchant to trade his family farm for a bulb of Semper Augustus is the same neurochemistry driving the modern cycles of meme stocks, NFTs, and the desperate scramble for the next moonshot asset. The Dutch Tulip Bubble teaches us the ultimate truth of the cinematic history of economics. Every bubble is essentially a crisis of meaning. It is the moment when a society collectively agrees to believe in a lie because the lie is more profitable than the truth. The Netherlands did eventually recover, but it was never the same. They moved from being a nation of bold explorers to a nation of cautious rentiers. They learned that when you build an empire on the trade of wind, you are at the mercy of the weather. They realized that the only true wealth is productivity, the ability of a people to create, to build, and to innovate. Everything else is just a hallucination written in ink. The story of the exploded tulip wealth is a reminder that in a world of global finance, there are no get-rich-quick schemes. There are only get-poor-slowly traps. Sovereignty is not just about having a flag. It is about having an economy that is tethered to reality. If your wealth depends on the greater fool showing up tomorrow morning, then you aren't an investor. You are a hostage to luck. And as the Dutch found out in the spring of 1637, luck is the most expensive thing you can ever buy. The tulip didn't destroy the Netherlands with fire or sword. It destroyed it with a promise. It proved that the most effective way to hollow out a superpower is not to attack its borders, but to infect its imagination. The Golden Age didn't end with a bang. It ended with a withered flower and a pile of worthless paper. This is the Wealth History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the bubble before it popped. History never repeats exactly, but it rhymes, and right now, the rhythm is starting to sound very familiar.